President John Magufuli has died at a hospital in Dar es Salaam. His vice president announced on state television on Wednesday. David Doyle has the report.
Tanzania's President John Magufuli has died. It was announced on Wednesday. Speaking on state television, Vice President Samia Suluhu Hassan said Magufuli had died of a heart condition at a hospital in Dar es Salaam. The 61-year-old, one of Africa's most prominent coronavirus skeptics, had not been seen in public since the end of February. Speculation was rife that he had contracted COVID-19. Magufuli had denounced measures to stop the spread of the virus and labelled vaccines a Western conspiracy. Last week, officials denied he was ill. Government figures also said Magufuli was working normally and that citizens should ignore rumours from outside the country. Tanzanian police have arrested 4 people since last week for allegedly spreading false information about the health of political leaders.
David Doyle of Reuters with that report. Tanzania's leadership faced calls for a smooth succession on Thursday following the death of President John Pombe Magufuli. An opposition leader urged the immediate swearing-in of Vice President Samia Suluhu Hassan as successor. Zito Kabwe, speaking to Reuters by phone from Dar es Salaam on Thursday morning, said that would avoid a constitutional vacuum and prevent uncertainty. Magufuli's death, the first of a Tanzanian leader while in office, opens the prospect that the country will gain its first female president. The constitution says Hassan, 61, should assume the presidency for the remainder of the 5-year term that Magufuli began serving last year after winning a second term. Hassan addressed the nation on television late on Wednesday, saying Magufuli had died from the heart disease that had plagued him for a decade. She said burial arrangements were underway for the 61-year-old leader, but did not indicate when she would be sworn in. Although Hassan publicly championed Magufuli's leadership style and frequently represented him abroad, she has been more soft-spoken and less confrontational than the president. If sworn in to serve the remainder of Magufuli's second term, Hassan would be the East African nation's first female president and the only female currently holding executive power in the region. Uganda on Wednesday launched a rapid COVID-19 antibody test partly funded by France that developers hope to market in sub-Saharan Africa, where the laboratory infrastructure needed for extensive novel coronavirus testing is thin. The test, which requires a finger prick to draw blood, was developed by a team at Makerere, Uganda's oldest public university, with partial funding from the French embassy. The East African country has long experience of infectious diseases like HIV and Ebola, which it has drawn on to develop diagnostics expertise. The kit, which has been approved by Uganda's state-run National Drugs Authority, has an accuracy rate of 70%, but researchers hope eventually to raise that to 90%. This is a story told through an intriguing film title, but one that makes you think about the food you eat and where that food comes from. I spoke to Finian Makepeace, co-founder, policy director, and lead educator at Kiss the Ground organization, and began by asking him what inspired him to produce the film Kiss the Ground.
About 8 years ago, myself and other co-founder were inspired to help get the word out. When we learned about this big solution, about rebuilding soil, the potential for humanity to be stewards of helping nature build soil faster than we ever thought was even possible, this seemed like something that was almost too good to be true. So that was the kind of impetus of the organization. And then about a year into the organization, we met Josh and Rebecca Tickell and were able to convince them to begin a project creating the film, Kiss the Ground.
There's so much bad news about our planet, it's overwhelming. Truth is, I've given up. This is the story of a simple solution, a way to heal our planet. The solution is right under our feet, and it's as old as dirt.
The film says the solution is right under our feet, but many people have no idea what agriculture is all about. Talk to us about that.
So We like to phrase regenerative agriculture is agriculture that's causing regeneration. So when we think about regeneration, for something to regenerate, it has to have been hurt, harmed, or degenerated, right? It has to be broken somehow to have it heal itself. So when we look at our soil and our land, a lot of our land that's been in agriculture has been degraded or depleted. So the soil that makes up our land has been degraded, and we can see this in the desertification and loss of biomass on our land. This amazing thing about the solution being under our feet is the carbon in our atmosphere, Esther, that's currently causing a global warming effect, is the very building block. Well, soil's also alive. So if we take the carbon out of the atmosphere, help plants pump that liquid sugar back into the ground, that liquid carbon back into the ground, we can build topsoil that's faster than we ever thought possible. So this is sequestering carbon at an immense scale. So the more severe weather, the more flooding, the more droughts that we face, when we have healthy soil, we can become more resilient, and we can help our fresh water supplies return. We can create abundance of food that's healthy, and so many other incredible factors that come with it.
So there's a little bit of science here, and it may be a little complex for people who don't know anything about agriculture, and especially what you just talked about, regenerative agriculture. Can you explain that in layman's language?
The structure of this is made from carbon, and that carbon came from carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So if we look at a leaf then, we say, well, the leaves, using energy from the sun, leaves are pulling in carbon dioxide that's in our atmosphere. In their stomata, they're using the energy of the sun and taking the carbon from carbon dioxide, connecting it with hydrogen and oxygen from H2O, water, and making carbohydrates. We didn't know that 30 to 40% of these liquid sugars are being pumped into the ground to feed microbes in the soil. And those microbes create soil aggregates, they build the soil, in essence. So essentially the short version of it is plants pull in carbon, and the soil microorganisms store it.
Let's turn to Africa's agriculture, where most people might argue it's mainly organic anyway. But as we know, things are changing very quickly in the continent as farmers look for new methods that cut down time to harvest. How do you change that mindset?
Well, the push for more mechanical and more amendments like fertilizers and even pesticides and herbicides and fungicides is increasing at an alarming rate through all of Africa, really, as production and bigger companies are coming in there expecting larger production, quicker increases there in yield and everything. Because when we're dealing with brittle environments all across Africa, we're dealing with land that's already fragile. That's where we're headed with big industrial chemical agriculture. Inevitably, the land will be degraded and it'll be left to die. It's done. It'll be too beat up.
We can fix a lot of our climate issues to bring the CO2 down into a living plant and put it back into the soil where it belongs.
Plants working with soil microorganisms, it seems too simple.
Healthy soils lead to a healthy plant, healthy human, healthy climate.
Moving to regenerative management is going to allow farmers to have more fertility versus less as things go. That means less input costs. That means more abundance, more regional sovereignty, water security, etc.
Join us tomorrow for part 2 of my interview with Finian Makepeace, co-founder of the film Kiss the Ground, where he talks about a dream he had at age 27 that changed his life. United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has agreed to an Ethiopian request for a joint investigation in the country's northern Tigray region, where Bachelet says possible war crimes may have been committed. Fighting between government troops and the region's former ruling party, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, has killed thousands of people and forced hundreds of thousands from their homes in the mountainous region of about 5 million. The United Nations has raised concerns about atrocities being committed in Tigray, while U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has described acts carried out in the region as ethnic cleansing. Ethiopia has rejected Blinken's allegation. The United Nations and the United States have demanded that Eritrean troops leave Tigray. Egypt is racing to prepare a grandiose new capital city in the desert east of Cairo before the first civil servants move in this summer and ahead of the delayed official opening of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's flagship project. Emily Wither reports.
Away from the chaos of overcrowded Cairo, a new capital is rising from the desert east of the city. Civil servants are due to start moving here this summer, ahead of the official opening planned for the end of 2021. Workers are putting finishing touches to an avenue of ministries that echo the architecture of pharaonic temples. There will be a monorail passing through a business district where a 385-metre central tower is close to completion. A 10-kilometre park stretching to a giant mosque is also taking shape. Known simply as the new administrative capital, the city is being designed as a high-tech model for Egypt's future. It will boast universities, leisure facilities and a diplomatic quarter. Control centres will monitor infrastructure and security electronically, and roofs will be covered in solar panels. Khalid Al-Husseini is the spokesman for the new capital.
We are aiming to facilitate the citizens' life. We are aiming to have a cashless community in the new capital. We are trying to solve all the problems we had in the past in the new capital.
President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's flagship project has made halting progress. Emirati funding fell through shortly after it was announced in 2015. The military and government took on the estimated $25 billion cost of the first phase, injecting off-budget investment. Some foreign loans and financing have been secured, including a Chinese loan that's helped fund the business district. How far and how fast Egypt's centre of gravity shifts away from Cairo to the new capital 45 kilometres from the Nile is unclear. For now, thousands of residential blocks stand empty either side of a highway leading into the new city. The completion of the business district, yet to be marketed, is set for 2023. Sisi says other regions will not be neglected. And while there's support for the government's argument that the new capital can reduce congestion in Cairo, there is also concern that it will be unaffordable and inaccessible to many.
That was Emily Wither of Reuters reporting. Coming up, a non-profit reopens a zoo left behind with starving animals by former Burkina Faso president 7 years ago. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Africa 54. Though Washington is the seat of U.S. political power, its residents have no voting rights in Congress, nor rights of full home rule because of its unique status as the federal capital. But advocates for making Washington, D.C. a state say they see more potential than ever. VOA's Carol Gansberg has our report.
When rioters attacked the U.S. Capitol in a failed attempt to stop Congress from certifying the presidential election of Joe Biden, Washington's Mayor Muriel Bowser lacked the authority to call in the National Guard to help police. The episode has given new momentum to the District of Columbia's long-running effort to become a state.
I'm upset that 706,000 residents of the District of Columbia did not have a single vote in that Congress yesterday, despite the fact that our people were putting their lives on the line to protect our democracy.
The district lacks local autonomy. Its budget and local laws, unlike those of states, are subject to approval by Congress. Its residents pay federal taxes but cannot send someone to Congress to cast votes on their behalf. Eleanor Holmes Norton has championed statehood for 3 decades as the district's non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives.
The United States is the only country that denies the residents of its capital city the same rights that everybody else has.
Norton introduced legislation, passed by the House last year, that would shrink the federal district to 2 square miles, including the Capitol, White House, and other major government buildings and monuments. The district's remaining 66 square miles would become the new state. The legislation was reintroduced in January with even more backers.
What is important is that we have the support of the new President of the United States, Joe Biden, as well as the support of the leaders of the Senate and of the House. That's a trifecta that's hard to beat.
But Republicans in Congress oppose statehood. Because the district's voters overwhelmingly support Democrats, that would mean 2 more Democrats in a Senate that is now evenly divided between the 2 major parties. Republican Congressman Dusty Johnson says Washingtonians do deserve representation, just not in a separate new state. His proposed legislation would make most of the district part of the neighboring state of Maryland, without adding seats in the House or Senate.
And if what D.C. residents really want is suffrage, if what they want is a voice in the United States Senate, my plan gives them that. I would say in the last 200 years, every single state that has been made a state has had either 6 million residents or has been 10,000 square miles. Washington, D.C. fails both of those tests.
But joining another state is just not acceptable to Washington pharmacist Oye Owowola.
We don't want to be residents of Maryland. We want to be D.C. residents. We also want to have our own voice. We want to be the 51st state, not to be absorbed in another one.
D.C. voters elected Owowola last fall as a backup delegate in the House of Representatives. He was born in the U.S. to parents from Nigeria, where residents of the Federal Capital Region do have legislative representatives with voting rights. Attorney Paul Strauss is one of the district's 2 elected shadow senators, again without voting rights. His goal is
to educate both Americans and the world about the importance of D.C. statehood and making sure that the United States lives up to the ideals that it preaches around the world.
A House panel will consider Norton's bill this month. While it may pass in the democratically controlled House, it is unlikely to pass in the Senate, where Democrats have only a slim margin of control. Carol Gunsberg, VOA News, Washington.
More than 650 copies of Dr. Seuss books have sold around the world since author Theodore Seuss Geisel published his first title in the 1930s. The prolific author of books like The Cat in the Hat is credited with helping millions of children learn to read. But this month, Dr. Seuss Enterprises announced it will no longer publish 6 of the celebrated author's books due to racist and insensitive imagery. VOA's Dora McQuarrie has our report. But first, a warning: the story you're about to watch contains images that many may find offensive.
The offending images in the 6 canceled Dr. Seuss books contain stereotypes of black people, Asians, and Arabs. Dr. Seuss author Theodore Seuss Geisel died in 1991. But this year on his birthday, the company founded by Dr. Seuss's family decided to stop printing 6 of his books because they portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong.
He often sees national or ethnic or racial difference as exotic and as fun or as funny. In highlighting the exotic of somebody or the otherness of somebody as a point of amusement, you are telling people that national or ethnic or racial difference can be the punchline. And that is painful if you are a member of the group who is the punchline.
Allegations of racial stereotypes in the author's work aren't new. The Dr. Seuss Museum in the author's hometown of Springfield, Massachusetts, removed a mural after complaints. The mural depicted a Chinese character with slanted eyes, chopsticks, and a pointed hat.
The librarians have known about this for a long time and have been discussing this for decades.
Jason Homer heads up a library system not far from the Dr. Seuss Museum. He says the author's books are not particularly popular at his libraries, but they will stay on the shelves.
In the top 100 children's checked out titles last year, only 1 Dr. Seuss book appeared, and that was Cat in the Hat. We're moving these books because people might object, are very much go against what we stand for as a public library. We want to provide materials. Our job is to enlighten, enrich, and inform our community.
Offensive at best and horribly racist at worst.
Geisel's racist imagery exists outside of his popular children's books. He published political cartoons during World War II containing harmful stereotypes of Japanese Americans that questioned their patriotism.
Supposedly Japanese figures with cookie-cutter faces, all of them similar, all of them male, marching down from Washington and Oregon into California to pick up blocks of TNT explosive. And the title of the cartoon is Waiting for the Signal from Home. The guy on the roof has a telescope pointed toward Japan.
There's evidence the author regretted his early depictions of non-white people. Some of his later books include lessons on tolerance and inclusion.
People often think of racism as either or. You're on team racism or you're not, and that's not actually how it works. Seuss is on both teams.
Philip Nell heads up the children's literature program at Kansas State University. He views the removal of the 6 Seuss books as an appropriate product recall.
Also, as a child, I think you're absorbing things that you don't know you're absorbing. You are learning things without your consent. These ideas, these images just start to populate your brain without you signing on to the idea that it's okay to mock people for being different or kind of highlight their exoticism to be amusing.
It's the end of the story for these 6 titles, but dozens of beloved Dr. Seuss books remain in print for future generations of children to discover. Dora McQuarr, VOA News, Washington.
There are no words or statistics that can accurately detail what the Syrian people have lost in 10 years of civil war. But as they mark this gruesome 10-year anniversary, people in Idlib, the last opposition stronghold in Syria, try to take stock of what has been destroyed and what, if anything, has been gained. VOA's Heather Murdoch has this report with Shadi Turk in Idlib.
11-year-old Tasneem Hassan and her family fled their home a year ago as government forces bombed her village here in Idlib, the last opposition stronghold, where nearly 1/4, 23%, of Syria's 17.5 million people now live. They went to 8 camps before they found a place to stay. The other camps were crowded and without running water. They would wait for it to rain so they could drink or cook. They finally found a camp with water and other humanitarian aid, but now it's mostly cut off.
Sometimes they bring us hygiene kits, but we don't want that. We need things for children like diapers, milk, and food. We want to eat. It has been 2 months since we received any food aid.
Tasneem doesn't remember a time before the war, but she remembers losing an uncle, her grandmother, 2 cousins, beloved family friends, and now, she says, hope.
I dreamed that we were happy and going back to our village. It was like before, and our home wasn't destroyed. But those are dreams. Everything will stay like it is.
She says when her village was attacked, her father's life was saved by a member of the White Helmets, a volunteer rescue group that operates in Syrian opposition areas. Ibrahim Mohammed has served with the White Helmets since 2014 and says he has pulled countless bodies, alive and dead, from the rubble of bombed-out buildings, including babies. He dropped out of college and lost his home and so many countrymen, but he did not lose everything.
We are living in the North with freedom, dignity, and on our land. We've lost so many people. Everyone has lost someone from their family.
The battles are almost over in most of Syria, and some analysts have declared President Bashar al-Assad the apparent winner. But rebel groups are in control of Idlib and nearby regions, and locals almost universally say they will flee or fight before trying to live in a government-controlled area. The war is at a stalemate, characterized by sporadic violence and a deepening humanitarian crisis. But 10 years on, locals say, it is not over. Heather Murdoch, VOA News.
When former President Blaise Compaoré fled Burkina Faso 7 years ago, he left behind a zoo of lions, ostriches, hippos, and hyenas, which began starving to death. A non-profit stepped in to rescue them last year and has reopened the zoo to the public, Henry Wilkins reports from Zineare.
Former Burkina Faso President Blaise Compaoré left behind a private zoo that included crocodiles, gorillas, hippos and lions. He continued to pay for the zoo, but the management team neglected the animals. The Association for the Protection of Fauna and Flora in Burkina Faso last year found animals like lioness Alma emaciated and starving.
Alma, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, Alma, I think, had about 1 or 2 weeks left to live. But maybe even that's optimistic. Perhaps a matter of days, and she would have died. The fact that 1 year later, she still finds herself on her feet and eating is really a miracle.
The baboons, gorillas, porcupines and tigers were among the animals that didn't survive. But Alma and the other lionesses recovered along with a host of other animals. Compaoré gave the APFF-BF power of attorney over the animals, and the zoo was open to the public with a small entrance fee.
The major challenges have been to find funding for animal feed. It's a big expense, you just don't realise it. There are more than 40 animals in the zoo, many of which are carnivores, so it costs a lot of money.
The zoo gets by on donations. Burkina Faso's violent insurgency dropped tourism and budgets for animal conservation.
There were good periods before the onset of insecurity in 2017. We had a budget of around $550,000. But for 2020 and 2021, I'm wondering if we'll even have a budget of $36,000.
As for Alma, she's become a much-loved symbol of the zoo's recovery.
We found aggressive, angry animals that no longer had hope in anything. And today, hope is returning to this park.
Henry Wilkins for VOA News, Zineare, Burkina Faso.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, we thank you for watching.
Deputies responded to this massage parlor here on Highway 92, just west of Bells Ferry Road, to a multiple people shot call.
What I saw was immediately apparent that what was on the back seat of this squad car was chewed up drugs. It looked like chewed up pills.
This alliance between us is, as we said, the linchpin.
This is a wide-ranging bill, Mr. President. It will prohibit ballot harvesting.
This entire bill was written around a vendor.
Unplugged in, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, imprisoned and unsure of his fate.
We thought the Kremlin is unlikely to go after somebody that they're at the same time bad-mouthing because it would make it too obvious who went after them. In Navalny's case, they did both.
After surviving a poisoning, the Putin critic is pushed further into Russia's prison system.
We imposed Russia sanctions on Alexei Navalny's poisoning and detention.
Beyond new sanctions, how might the new American president change the U.S. relationship with Moscow? Unplugged in, U.S.-Russia, sanctions and policy. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. Alexei Navalny says he's being held about 100 kilometers from Moscow in what he calls a real concentration camp. Russia's opposition leader was jailed in January after returning to Russia after an attempt to kill him by poison. Navalny was sentenced to prison for parole violations dating back a few years. Navalny's lawyer confirms his client was recently transferred to Penal Colony No. 2 in Russia's Vladimir region. Navalny's jailing sparked protests across Russia and generated demands from around the world for his release. In response to the jailing, the United States imposed new economic sanctions.
It's clear
that Russian officials targeted Mr. Navalny for his activism and his efforts to reveal uncomfortable truths about Russian officials' corruption and to give voice to Russian citizens' legitimate grievances with their government and its policies. We are exercising our authorities to send a clear signal that Russia's use of chemical weapons and human rights abuses have severe consequences.
With its new leader now in prison, Russia's opposition movement faces an uncertain future with parliamentary elections. Those elections are scheduled for September. VOA's Charles Maines tells us more from Moscow.
Vladimir Oblast, less than 100 kilometers from Moscow. The prison Alexei Navalny will call home for at least the next 2.5 years is said to be among Russia's most oppressive and brutal. And it's just one of many ways the government continues to apply pressure on the opposition figure and those seeking political change. Opposition candidates and municipal deputies gathered recently in Moscow to discuss strategies for competing in the country's fall elections, asking how to beat the odds and win local races against a Kremlin-backed political machine. They never got their answer. Police broke up the proceedings, arguing the event had ties to a foreign NGO the state deemed undesirable in 2017. With the entire conference placed under arrest, those who were there described it as an exercise in the absurd.
The events in our country of late are such that the writer Franz Kafka could only envy. He couldn't possibly have had enough imagination to make this up.
Fear has become the Kremlin's primary tactic as it tries to keep government opponents off the ballot and clearly off the streets. Thousands were detained during protests that followed Navalny's detention, with many kept in grim conditions and family members in the dark.
I couldn't get any information at all. You call and they tell you nothing. And now, only at midnight, did I find out he was at the prison here.
While others subsequently faced a more Soviet response to political dissent.
We were waiting for our coup to take place. We were waiting inside the van, right beside the court. And there I read, I was fired from the institution where I used to work.
With the government promising further crackdowns, Navalny's allies called for a moratorium on street protests until the spring.
If we keep coming out every week, thousands more will be arrested and hundreds beaten.
They're pushing instead for more symbolic acts and rallying international pressure. The U.S. and European allies have both demanded Navalny's release, but also joined in imposing sanctions against high-ranking Russian officials, even if it's with the knowledge, say observers, that the measures change the Kremlin's calculus only so far.
They're not effective, and I'm not sure that there are any kind of sanctions that could influence what happens inside the country. I think the only purpose these sanctions serve is a kind of a signal to Kremlin that what happened is not unnoticed.
Yet Navalny's attacks on government corruption and his growing profile at home and abroad clearly has the Kremlin's attention as well. After years of treating him as politically irrelevant, the Kremlin now prefers the opposition figure out of the picture, whatever the cost. Charles Maines for VOA News, Moscow.
I spoke to Charles Maines for a sense of the political climate in Moscow and whether Navalny's jailing is affecting Vladimir Putin's grip on power. Can you tell me the political climate right now in Moscow and in Russia, if there's a way to describe it?
Well, I think it's clear that you've seen these very significant events over the last half year, starting with the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, his evacuation in a coma to Germany, his resurrection, he recovered, and then made this kind of amazing return to Russia. I mean, these are big, big events unfolding. And, on the one hand, we saw, of course, people come out on the streets, but it didn't seem to kind of fundamentally change anything. I think there was an assumption from Navalny and his allies that this would put pressure and really, really transform the political situation here. What we've seen, though, is, of course, with these protests and against Mr. Navalny himself, repression. Fear seems to be the government's main tactic. We saw it in the way that they've sentenced Alexei Navalny to over 2.5 years in prison for these past alleged parole violations, while not investigating his poisoning. And at the same time, we've also seen, over 10,000, 11,000 people arrested over a series of protests in January and February. Just over this past weekend, I was at a pro-democracy forum where municipal candidates were gathering just to talk strategies for the fall elections here in Russia. That was met with police. They stormed the conference and arrested the entire conference. So repression seems to be the main factor here.
Has the jailing of Navalny had any impact on Putin's grip on power?
I think before the sense was that if they gave him a long-term prison sentence, that this would invite protests at home and also a lot of condemnation abroad. But now what we see is a moment where Russia is being condemned for other things already. So the idea of more sanctions on sanctions doesn't have quite as much of a bite. And Navalny himself it's also become very personal between Mr. Putin and Mr. Navalny. He released a video claiming corrupt practices by Mr. Putin, allegedly having this sort of incredible palace in the south of Russia along the Black Sea. There seems to be some truth to it. And although Mr. Putin, I should say, has denied the charges, but a good friend of his claimed to now own the property. But this has suddenly really kind of intruded into Mr. Putin's private circles, and I think that seems to have kind of personalized this conflict between these two men to the point where Putin is out to punish him.
Do you have any sense of what Navalny's followers would like to see the United States do or not do vis-a-vis Navalny?
They've made it quite clear they disagree with the United States for issuing what they call sectoral sanctions, so targeting the Russian economy. They see that essentially rallying Russians around Putin or the government per se. And so what they're suggesting is a list of what they call the financiers of Mr. Putin or some of his closest advisors or his friends and his cronies. And they think essentially that's the way to target the Russian government and not target the Russian people. Certainly what they've seen from the Biden administration at this point, they're hoping it's just the beginning. We've seen essentially sanctions against 8 high-ranking Russian government officials, some concerns, some organizations as well that allegedly have ties to chemical weapons development, but not against the financiers, which seems to be a key issue for Navalny's allies.
What do you think is going to happen in the elections in September? Any thought?
If you go back to the poisoning this past August, Mr. Navalny was actually traveling in Siberia trying to rally people around this smart voting campaign that he and his team essentially had come up with. And the idea was to target the unpopularity of the ruling United Russia Party, and that's by pooling votes towards one candidate in particular. So they didn't care who they were, what their views were, but as long as they weren't affiliated with the Kremlin, they would target all the votes this way. And they ran this campaign in 2019 as kind of a test run. And it did have some effectiveness in some races, in some towns, not everywhere, but certainly in Moscow it did, in some towns in Siberia it did. And there was some sense that there's concern there that this could happen again. So it'll be interesting to see if they can keep that momentum going without sort of Mr. Navalny's charisma, use of social media, if people will stay kind of involved in the fight with essentially the leader of it behind bars.
A few days after Navalny's January arrest, his anti-corruption foundation released a video on social media. His foundation claims the video shows a billion-dollar palace built by friends of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin has dismissed the claims, and they have not been independently verified. But the video of a lavish palace has generated hundreds of millions of views on YouTube, raising Navalny's profile in Russia. We have a report from our sister network, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
This is an artist's impression of a strip club in a secret palace for the enjoyment of Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to a new YouTube video with tens of millions of views.
This room is also equipped with a large stage and an extraordinary thing. The stage has an elevator with a pole. We can't imagine what a pole on a stage is for.
The video was made by opposition leader Alexei Navalny and posted by his supporters after he was jailed. He claims to have received